let me just address this because both you and Martin raised this. I mean, it's interesting, sort of the focus is on uncertainty with respect to tax policy. Keep in mind that my administration has already been very unequivocal in saying that we will not change taxes at all for 98% of Americans, which you'd think would provide some level of certainty. That with respect to aggregate demand, I don't know any economist, including, I think, Martin, who would argue that we are more likely to get a bump in aggregate demand from $700 billion of borrowed money going to people like those of us around this table who I suspect if we want a flat screen TV can afford one right now and are going out and buying one. If we were going to spend $700 billion, it seems that we'd be wiser having that $700 billion go to folks who would spend that money right away if we were going to boost aggregate demand. And the consequences of extending the upper income tax cuts, based on what we've already heard fairly explicitly in the political environment, is that you do that now, you're going to do it forever. There's not going to be necessarily a deal that says, as Martin, I think, an entirely respectable position is to say, extend them all for 2 years and then they go away, right? I mean, that's an intellectually consistent position. But that's not really the position that is being promoted up on Capitol Hill. And so the question is, if I can achieve certainty for 98% of the people affected by the tax code, and there's an argument about the 2%, primarily because there's also great uncertainty about our deficits and how we're going to pay for those over the long term, why wouldn't I go ahead and promote certainty on the bulk of these taxes, and also in that way preserve some flexibility to do something about a deficit which everybody says is out of control and that we're going to have to do something with immediately. I will allow Martin to respond only because I named him in my comment. And then I'm going to bring in the big guns. I'm going to have Laura come in. So go ahead. Go ahead.
Well, I have discussion earlier before you joined us. There's this concern about the business community's attitude about the administration, and it's not just the business community, it's high-income individuals, entrepreneurs, and others. And so the increase in the tax on those individuals is a signal that the administration, that they're going to have to pay higher taxes, and it may be even more going forward. But so it's more than just the mechanical whether they can afford another flat screen TV, but how they think about their business life and economic life going forward.
I understand your point, and we can't belabor this. I just think it's a very interesting discussion because essentially what the argument comes down to is that the psychology of those of us, and I'm in this category, those of us who are wealthy and make a lot of decisions that determine whether investments are made or not, that our psychology is sufficiently important that even if we don't need a tax cut, we should give them a tax cut, we should give us a tax cut in order to induce us to play ball, because otherwise we're going to take the ball and go home. And I understand the argument, and it may be true, but I think that you might understand how folks who have, as you pointed out, seen their home go underwater by $100,000, or have lost their jobs, or having trouble making ends meet, and they're thinking, boy, I could use tax relief right now. They might feel like they're being held hostage here. And that they also know that down the road we're going to have to make decisions about spending cuts to offset whatever tax breaks or expenditures we put out there. And that they, in the weaker position, are going to be ones who are really hurt. So this is something that we're going to have to wrestle with as a society. particularly given, Martin, that the group that you're talking about that you said psychologically might need a tax cut are the folks who disproportionately have been benefiting over the last 2 or 3 decades from all the growth in productivity, so that they have a larger share, we have a larger share of income and wealth than we have at any time since, what, the 1920s? You probably know the statistics better than I do. So, Laura, do you want to, let me actually get some economic help here.
Well, you know, I didn't come prepared to talk to the tax issue. I will say a couple of things, having listened to the discussion. One is I'm struck by the fact that a lot of the companies we talk about having lots of cash, where it sits, if you read the report, say, of the Business Council, Business Roundtable, National Association of Manufacturers, if you listen to the CEOs of big companies sitting here, this tax issue doesn't come up. So I don't really believe, and I don't think there's evidence that we can point to document that the uncertainty about what's going to happen to the tax rate of the top 2% of Americans who share the share of income now that they had in 1928, that is really what's holding the economy back. I just don't, I'm not convinced, and I don't hear from the business community in general that that's the issue. If they're going to talk about taxes, the business community that I know with large amounts of cash that could employ large numbers of people are more likely to talk about corporate tax reform. They're more likely to talk about repatriation. They're more likely to talk about deferral. They're not talking about their particular income tax bracket. So I just am not convinced. And finally, I didn't come prepared to say this, but I would say I just go with the CBO here. If you take the money and spend it on something that is more demand generating. You know, bring the revenue in from the top 2% and use it to fund a national infrastructure bank. Use it to fund a tax cut to basically a temporary tax cut on payrolls. Use it to fund state and local governments on Arnie's education initiative. The money can be used in a more demand-generating way if that's what we need to do. So I'm not convinced that uncertainty about the tax rate really has to do with our problem. It is primarily an aggregate demand problem. You've articulated it completely. Your team knows it, and you know it. The size of the problem is very large. Marty mentioned that as well. And we have limited tools because we're in a fiscal hole at the beginning. I think that's why, and I would point here, if there's any debate about whether there is uncertainty about aggregate demand, let's just point to the Federal Reserve and listen to their discussions. Their discussions indicate that they are very uncertain about the state of aggregate demand and that they are beefing up their toolbox of things they can do if things falter more than they expect. So there is a huge amount of uncertainty about the strength of demand. It's weak, and we don't know how fast it's going to recover. That's the reality. So what can you do on the fiscal side? I think what you have been doing and what we have been talking about are the things we really have to focus on. You have to focus on things where you can spend a limited amount of funds, perhaps by taking in the revenue from the top 2%, but you can spend some funds on projects like infrastructure that both create demand now because they hire people to do the projects now. That's what Jim has been talking about from the beginning, the importance of infrastructure as a way to hire people now. But brilliantly, such projects also create supply for the future. They also make us more competitive for the future. And furthermore, if you fund a lot of these projects through public-private partnerships, they will be paid for. They don't add to the long-run deficit. And also, there's this wonderful thing of leverage. You know, the CEA report on the stimulus package in July there was a very good last section there saying about $300 to $400 billion of the stimulus package, or actually I guess it was $100 to $200 billion, had leverage with the private sector of 3 to 4 times. That's the kind of project where a little government money on an infrastructure project can bring in a lot of money. A little money on alternative energy can bring in a lot of money. A little money on R&D. So I would urge you to think about leverage where a dollar of fiscal spending, and this is spending money primarily, or targeted tax relief can leverage a lot of private money. And of course, what we're talking about, how we started the program today, is exactly that. We're talking about partnership, where the government isn't putting in many resources at all, it's putting in some, but you mobilize the private sector. So that's, aggregate demand is the issue. We have limited fiscal tools. But I think if we focus on infrastructure, you focus on education, you focus on R&D, alternative energy, places where the private sector really wants to be with you, you'll get a lot of leverage and you'll get some jobs.
I'm going to let, I'd like to hear Paul chime in, and then Mark, maybe you can address another source of uncertainty that's at least been expressed, and that's regulatory uncertainty, and then I think we can wrap up. So,
I'm going to demonstrate that the chairman of this committee faces an unruly membership, has their own mind. But I want to assure you that my psychology will not be affected by returning to the tax rate, which you expect that are in existing law. And given the deficit we have, I'm just repeating the arguments, if you're looking for the priorities of where to provide some stimulus, the most unlikely place to apply stimulus would be for those that already have so much of the wealth of the country that has been accumulated over 2 decades, when the people under 250,000 have had no increase in real income during this period of time. And it seems to me the argument, whatever the precise number is very strong. In fact, I don't understand the opposite argument, but that's beside the point, maybe.
all right, Mark?
I have a couple quick comments. Probably